This is David Grasso with another episode of Follow the Prophet. Today I'm joined by someone from our profession. We have a shared profession, which is journalism, which some people call the fastest disappearing white-collar profession in the world. None other than Dina Demetrius. Demetrius, I believe it is in Greek. How are you doing today, Dina? Greetings from Florida to sunny LA.
Well, greetings to you too from sunny LA to Florida. Thanks for having me.
So, what is it like to be a journalist? I know I could talk about this at length, but you have that same war paint on your face that I do. Talk about a
Yeah.
difficult field. Tell me about your experience.
So, it is a roller coaster to say the least. I mean, I think that it is one of the most satisfying and amazing jobs that somebody can have. It is also deeply difficult at times, and it is becoming increasingly so, I think, in a lot of ways, both financially for individual journalists, both in terms of the time and the resources that you're allotted to do the kind of journalism that you want to do. And if you're freelance, as more and more journalists are becoming, that is a whole other level of up and down that you're needing to deal with in terms of the types of stories that you're pitching to various news organizations, the financial sustainability of that. So there's a lot going on in journalism right now and for journalists as individuals in terms of making their way and continuing to do the work that they love to do that honestly I feel like a lot of us have a calling to do.
Yeah, I feel like I didn't really have a choice but to enter this field. Obviously, I was well aware of the financial challenges, but every type of personality test I took revealed politician or journalist, so I erred on the side of journalism. What was
Right.
your adventure to journalism? Like, how did you wake up one day and say, wow, I'm just a glutton for punishment. I want to make my life difficult, yet very satisfying, as you said.
Well, I'm Generation X, so it wasn't necessarily a thought of this is going to be a difficult road. And honestly, there have been times when it's been wonderful and pretty easy, and other times when it's been more challenging. So again, it's a back and forth in that way. But as a child, I was really I had news had an impact on me. Watching television news was really affecting me, and my parents weren't the type of parents, they're Greek immigrants. It's like whatever's on TV, okay, if we're watching it, you're watching it too. And so I wasn't shielded from the news of the day. Like I think a lot of parents are doing that now, and I understand why, but I wasn't shielded. So these stories had an impact on me, and I was a storyteller from the time I could speak. I was always telling stories to my younger brother and sister. I was telling stories. That was who I was from the very beginning. And so I thought, well, if I'm going to be a storyteller, I want to tell real people's stories. I want to be able to have the type of impact on people that this information and these types of stories have had on me growing up. And on top of that, and you may realize this too from your family history, my parents are immigrants from Greece. I'm first generation. And so I was surrounded by their stories, not just their immigration stories, but also their stories of living in occupied Greece during the Nazi occupation and what that was like for them as little children and growing up. And so all these stories around me having to do with current events in people's lives really mattered to me. So at some point in my early teenage years, I decided, well, maybe journalism is for me. And I was lucky enough to have a television station in my high school. We took television. I was able to take television classes. We had a TV station in there, a community station, and so I started my own news magazine show from the time I was 16, and hosted and produced it and everything. And so launched myself that way and went to college, and then afterwards went to Washington D.C. to work as a journalist.
So you've tackled some pretty tough issues, which, I think that comes with the hardness of having an immigrant family, right? We come from war-torn regions, the
Right.
hard scrabble upbringing. You're kind of able to face head-on things like, and I'm seeing here in my notes, mental illness in prisons, fracking, workers' rights. These are touchy, complicated issues to break down for any audience, never mind on video.
You need to
How is
have
your
a backbone of steel, to tackle those. Yeah, for sure.
How do you channel people's stories without seeming biased? Because that seems to be a big challenge in today's media landscape.
Yeah. You know, that that has become quite a topic, and it is difficult sometimes. My When I approach a story, I'm not approaching it from the point of view of, am I telling all the sides, or am I including this person's opinion and that person's opinion? My goal is always, I'm trying to find the truth. I'm trying to understand what the facts are, so that I can let people know that this is how this particular issue is going to impact their lives, or is impacting their lives at this time. So it, I don't think about it too much in terms of a political bias. I think of it in terms of what is the question we're trying to answer. So with fracking, right? I mean, there are political opinions on both sides of that particular issue. My question in pursuing that fracking investigation, as an example, is is fracking actually happening in California? And the state regulator had absolutely no idea. Why? Because they weren't asking the question in the oil forms that oil companies were filling out to find out if the types of methods that they were using included fracking. So they had absolutely no idea. People need to know if fracking is happening in their area. That's one of the environmental concerns that people have. So it's not a matter of political bias, it's a matter of trying to find out what is actually happening, what the truth is, what the facts are, and allowing people to make that decision themselves in terms of which way they fall in the political spectrum with regard to that issue.
But Dina, you bring up an important issue, right? Which there are a lot of stories out there. Never mind political bias. There's just lack of process, a need, a cause. Why does everything seem to be just an outrage factory these days, specifically tailored for left or right wing audiences? And everything seems to have a political bent. But as you've mentioned,
Right.
stories are stories. They don't really have politics.
Well, they have politics in the sense that they impact people's lives, and so you're going to be making a decision one way or another with regard to the issue, but you don't have to approach the telling of that story from a political angle, right? You have to approach it, I think, and the way I've done it, from a human angle. This is affecting all humans. It doesn't matter if fracking is happening next to somebody who's Republican or next to somebody who's Democrat. It is still happening, and you need to make your own political decision about what that means for you. The reason why I think there's so much outrage at this point is because that is what's driving social media. That is what's driving the online news forums. And so people are, this has been talked about endlessly, clickbait, right? So you're looking at a headline, it's meant to be outrageous. Some people who are into that outrage will click on it, and so they'll get advertising eyes on it, and that's what drives that particular form of news. But to me, there's an ever greater divide between what we're calling news and what we're calling journalism. Those two words used to be synonymous, they used to be interchangeable, and I think that's becoming less the case because of what you're saying, because of these outrage headlines that are meant to just make people click on it, and it doesn't matter what the outcome really is. It's just meant to generate anger, and that's what it's doing on both sides of the aisle.
Does it ever just kind of burn out and create a point where for people just want zero opinion journalism or news or
Yeah.
information?
Yeah, absolutely. It causes burnout, and we've been seeing it. I think particularly in this past year and a half, when we've been dealing with the pandemic, people have just. I think a lot of people have just had it. I'll tell you, I have a cousin who is pretty middle of the road in the Midwest in Illinois, who sort of messaged me in the beginning of the pandemic and said, I can't take this anymore. I don't know who to believe. I don't know what to do. Who do you suggest I look to for news? And so I gave my opinion on places that I think do really good journalism. And I gave him some options. And I also told him, look at this website, mediabiasfactchecker.com. They're going to, that's what they do. They'll tell you, are they fact checking? Are they promoting conspiracy theories and so on for all the different news organizations that there are? And so that's something that I think an audience needs to take upon themselves is ask a trusted journalist. I'm a trusted journalist to my cousin. So he asked me and I gave him my opinion on that. These are people who these are journalists who are vetted, who know how to vet information, who know how to vet people that they're interviewing. And that is critical to understanding and getting the right information on a variety of topics.
So you're freelancing these days for CBS, which I think is the gold standard in mainstream media, and I'm not just saying
I
that
agree.
because you work for them. Yeah.
No, I'm not just saying that
What
too because I work for them. Yeah, they're great.
Yeah, so from a journalist standpoint, like if I had to watch TV, I would probably be more likely to watch CBS than the competitors. Um, so what do you think that CBS does better than the competitors? I would think that it's really present more information in a more fulsome fashion instead of just random sound bites.
Yeah, there's that. Look, a lot of news organizations will do that as well. I think it's a matter also of having a particular ethos within the company, within the news organization itself. Look, you're going to take on the characteristics of the people you surround yourself with, and I have found the people I've started working with at CBS to be people, journalists of integrity who are interested in telling stories that matter to people, and their journalism process is is there and it's solid and it's filled with integrity. That's not always the case because of in part because of the speed that news travels, and so things sort of get pushed under the rug. They're not done as thoroughly as they need to be. But for other news organizations, that's not the case. And CBS, I think you're right, is at the top of that. They're just people of integrity, and they're journalists who are trained, and that is a big deal. Just because an organization has the word news in it doesn't mean it's providing you with journalism, and
Well,
that's something to really think about.
what are some of the stories you've been working on lately for, as a CBS freelancer? You focus on the Los Angeles area, is that correct?
Well, yes, it comes out of Southern California, and I'm working for NewsPath, which is the part of CBS News which provides stories, national stories for all the different CBS stations around the country, so that they can incorporate them into their local newscasts. And a lot of the stories have been medical stories, they've been consumer stories. What travel has been like now that the Delta variant has emerged. Um, RV shortages, medical stories about double transplants for a teenager, the the latest on COVID studies and so on. So there's a lot of that. They're relatively short compared to what I'm used to reporting, but they're great and they're very timely and they're very useful to people who are watching the CBS stations around the country. So they're really great stories.
So you worked for other organizations like Al Jazeera and other nonprofits as well. What was that like?
You know, I really love the stories that I was doing, that I had been able to do for KCT, which is a PBS station here in Los Angeles, and for Al Jazeera America when that was around. And the reason is that pretty much anything I pitched that um, needed to be deeply investigated was something that they would love for me to do, and I was able to do that. So I had the ability and the resources to be able to investigate issues, to dive deeply into social justice stories, and really tell them from different perspectives, because I had the time, both in terms of the length of the story and the length of the process, to research the story, to incorporate as many voices as I thought were needed in there. So
I,
those were really great times. Yeah.
I don't think people understand, though, the life of a journalist. I was a local reporter myself, and the demand for stories and good stories always exceeded our bandwidth to cover them. And now we see a
Absolutely.
lot of news deserts in the country, especially at the local level. Has that been lost permanently, or do you think that there's ever going to be a way to bring back that tradition of strong journalism, especially at the local level?
I really hope so, David, because you're right. It is heartbreaking every time I see that another local newspaper has shut down because they're out of money. They can't hire, they can't keep their reporters. It's really terrible. It breaks my heart for the journalists involved, and it breaks my heart for that community, because they don't have anyone to tell their stories. They don't have anyone to hold the elected people around them accountable. And so that is a huge part of journalism. It is actually a pillar of journalism to hold those in power accountable. And so, yeah, there are many, many news deserts around. What I hope is that maybe people in those communities will gather, the journalists there will gather and create nonprofits for themselves to tell stories from a hyper local level in that way. And that we see that starting to happen over the past 5 years. But I think some really great journalism is happening at a nonprofit level. ProPublica is a fantastic example of that. They do amazing investigations. They tell fantastic stories that I think everybody should be reading, and they're a nonprofit. The 19th News is another nonprofit newsroom. So I think it might be heading in that direction. At least I hope so, as another way to grow those newsrooms again in areas where they've just been decimated.
Well, I run a nonprofit news brand exactly for that because margins are so low and advertising skews
Yeah,
so much of your editorial mission that it becomes easier to run nonprofits. And so I'm going to steal your
absolutely.
pitch there, Dina. So I
Yeah,
saw this crazy
you will.
bumper sticker. I saw this crazy bumper sticker on the way back from South Carolina a few days ago. It said defund the media, which doesn't even make any sense, but let's put that aside, right?
Okay, good luck with that.
Yeah, trust in the media is at an all-time low, right? And
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure Congress is less trusted, but we're basically on par with proctologist appointments, and uh,
Yeah.
some
Yeah.
cleaning out your septic tank, so stuff that is very unpleasant. How did we get here?
I don't know. It makes me sad. Um, well, yeah, how did we get here? There are there are companies, there are creating newsrooms that are not telling the news. So that's a big thing. So now then you've got one side of the political spectrum doing that, and then it gets countered by the other side, and then there's this tit for tat between the right and the left in terms of really struggling to get those eyeballs, and it just becomes a tug of war, and a fight that you see between kids on the street. It's really disheartening in a lot of ways, but that I can tell you, I mean, and you may know this too from your own experiences as a journalist. The vast majority of the journalists I know are really doing a yeoman's job at trying to tell the stories that they think are important for their community and for the nation, and maybe globally if that's the level that they're working at. This is really a calling for them, and so it's really sad that they're getting swept up in the corporate tit for tat that is really decimating the the political discourse and the social discourse in this country and frankly around the world. Um, and they're getting swept up in that, and but they're part of those organizations anyway. So again, I think the nonprofit route is a great way to counter that. But I do think that there are organizations, news organizations. Look, I'll just say it. PBS NewsHour, I think, is a great program. CBS News is great. NPR is great. There are news organizations that I hope audiences will gravitate toward more to and support them with their eyeballs, so that they really get better journalism out of this, and fill their heads and their hearts with real stories that matter, and not support stuff that is you know tearing things down.
Well, I'm going to pick on one outlet. So I grew up like you, Dina. I'm not that much younger than you, idolizing CNN, of course, cable
Uh
news
huh.
network, right? And there was this, they
Yeah.
had this, reputation for being this, you know, unbiased, straight news, the best journalist. It was always my dream to work at CNN, right? And suddenly they got on this whole outrage machine and the punditry and the really stepped outside of their brand mission. And basically, these days, CNN doesn't resemble what it used to be, for better or for worse. Maybe some people like it now. It's just from an outside perspective, it seems like they really built their brand around Trump. And now that Trump's gone, they're kind of struggling to find their way in terms of how they can make any money and kind of have,
Yeah.
a mission.
Yeah. Well, I think they're seeing themselves. Look, I had many years ago an interview with the bureau chief at Fox News here in LA, national, the network, and we were having a discussion over, well, are you actually incorporating people from the other side in the stories when you say it's balanced? Is there actually balance within the story? And his response to me is, no, we see ourselves as a balance to all the other liberal media. And I said, well, I don't think this is going to be a good fit. This is not, how I approach a story. I think that's what you're seeing now with some of what's going on at CNN. I think their investigative work and their daily stories and the journalists who are working in the field are still providing excellent journalism. But I think you're right. As a brand, they have started shifting over to be a balance in their minds to what they're seeing as, you know, the right the right wing angle of that. So yeah, I mean, look, news organizations evolve, I guess, and that's the way they're choosing to evolve at this point. Will they evolve in another way again? Maybe. You know,
Well, they might be forced to be evolved,
they
Dina,
might be
because
forced.
now,
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, do people younger than us watch cable news? I ask my staff at Bold TV pretty often, and it doesn't seem they even watch cable news. I mean,
Well,
it
look, I
seems to
mean, I
be,
don't think so. Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think so. And that may be partly why they're doing that, is to, you know, to gain attention and to be part of that heightened level of discourse that seems to be so prevalent in cable anyway. But no, I don't think younger people are watching cable. It seems to me, and it's not, and I think younger people, I think millennials and younger, are not averse to long form, right? They're listening to podcasts. They're watching things on other platforms, but they're not necessarily watching cable news. So I think that's the difference, and I think it's something that news organizations, the legacy ones, are seeing. And so you see NBC News starting their NBC News streaming service, right, and hiring a bunch of journalists for that now. So as long as something is mobile, then that's great. CNN is somewhat mobile, but the primary viewers are on cable, and they're older.
that's a really
So will it
important
last?
point
I don't
because
know.
when we talk about young people like they're cord cutters and like they never watch multimedia ever again, like they fell
Yeah,
off the face of the planet. It's
right.
actually kind of absurd the way we talk about it. Like they're not consuming content. You talk to young
But this
people and
is
they
because
consume content.
older people are putting them in a box, right? And they're all like this, but that's not the case. I'm constantly, anytime I'm around. younger generations than mine, I'm always asking them, so where are you getting your news? How are you watching it? Where are you listening? And all that kind of stuff. And this is what I'm hearing. It's not that they're averse to those platforms. It's that they want something that's more mobile, and they want something that's actually going to be meaningful. And the tit for tat and the heightened discourse is not something that resonates with them, is what it seems like to me.
No, it really doesn't. And what's funny is there's a huge economic incentive to develop brands that really appeal to young people because this is kind of the wild, wild west right now. Nobody knows where young people will be
Yeah.
consuming their news. And we talk about news not being profitable. But if someone can figure that out, they're going to be the next big thing here.
I mean, can't you see it being somehow, like virtual reality related or something? Something's going to change, right? I mean, when I was first coming up, I remember, the veterans I was working with lamenting that film had gone away because it provided them the time and the ability to really tell a good story in this really beautiful way. And I'm like, tape is so much better. It's faster, And so as we move on, the technology changes and it provides us with different platforms and different ways that we can consume journalism. And I continue to use the word journalism instead of news because I want it to be clear that for me that's what's important. It's the storytelling at the end of the day, and how is that storytelling getting told.
Yeah, specifically what I've noticed is there's a lot more documentaries, right? Talking
Yes.
about
Yep.
important issues in a long form. I feel like there's a huge need for that. And you have some experience in that field.
I do. I mean, documentary work is so amazing. You get to really dive into people's lives. You get to dive into issues. I had the good fortune of being sent to direct and produce work down in Nicaragua, and we followed a family an American family that sold everything they owned to start an orphanage in Managua, and just really changed their lives. And of course, change the lives of the children and the families who they helped. And then while we were there, we also went into the largest garbage dump in all of Central America where people live. They had been displaced by hurricanes and were living in abject poverty in these garbage dumps. And this is how they were making their living, is picking through for copper and anything else they could find to sell off for recycling. And it was horrifying, but it changed me. And it's important to tell those stories. And I think people of all ages are interested in documentary film work right now. They're interested in really understanding um, human stories at a deeper level, and that's something that needs to be supported even more, right? Is documentary film work. And you see some of that happening with CNN, right? They're supporting documentary films.
Yes.
They have their own films over there, their own film
They're
division.
rolling out their own
And
channel. Yeah.
exactly. So that's important, and that's something that I hope continues to grow, because it is an important source of journalism, is to do those documentaries.
Yeah, I'm specifically seeing a renaissance in documentaries about environmental issues because oftentimes,
Yeah.
as you know through your fracking coverage, environmental issues are very complex. They're not just like, oh, just stop and suddenly, all our problems are solved. These are all interconnected problems that have to
Yeah.
do with economics, poverty, you know, corporations, government regulation. Talk about just a crash course in humanity when you cover environmental issues.
It really is. It's very complex. They're often hard stories to tell, because especially visually, because you can have nice visuals of like oceans and fish and whatever, but you're not able to see what the environmental damage is sometimes, or what that could look like if things were improved in a particular area. So it is a hard story to tell. And um, and so you need to approach it, as always, I think, from the perspective of somebody who's being having an impact on it, or is being impacted by it. And so to work your way in through through the human aspect of it, helps people to understand how these environmental policies affect them, and how they can start to think about them. A lot of environmental reporting, I think, could could go toward the direction of solutions type journalism, where you really investigate where the problem is, why it is that way, who's involved, and that way provide a roadmap to what a solution may be. And I think there's a lot of that that's going on. I know ProPublica is pretty great at that, but it's something that can be applied specifically to reporting on environmental issues.
So, Dina, I have to bring California into this because I am soon headed that way. We'll be
Mhm.
spending more time there. California is always, the saying has always been, as goes California, so goes the nation, right? It's usually
Yeah.
the trendsetter, whether it's economics, government, culture, etc. California seems to be in trouble. No matter what your politics are, hundreds of thousands of people have left. The population perhaps has dropped
Yeah.
for the first time in recent
Yeah.
history. What's going on in California? That's probably the number one question I get as a journalist, by the way. What's up with California? And what can we do
Housing.
about it?
Housing. That's the number one issue. That is the number one issue on so many levels. If you're really wealthy, you're doing okay, of course. If your middle class, is getting harder and harder to be in affordable housing that is anywhere near you being able to reasonably commute to your work, right? If you're on the edge financially, your chances of becoming homeless increase. The homelessness issue is growing, right? And there's not that much that's being done to really address it in a systemic way. So the housing is, I think, the biggest issue. I did a report on this a couple of years ago when I was hosting In Focus at Spectrum News One here in Los Angeles. And it is one of the driving forces for why people are leaving the state. It's just too expensive to have a roof over your head. And there isn't enough of it. There isn't enough affordable housing. And when new housing is being built and being zoned for by a city or by the county, 25% of it is affordable housing, and then the rest is luxury units. So that makes it even harder. So that's I think the biggest reason. And is the rest of the country going to go in that direction? I sure hope not, but that's what's happening here.
Well, single family home zoning was invented famously in Berkeley, California. And it's
Yeah.
actually one of the weirdest policies to come out of the left wing, in my opinion, because, uh, pro people policies, you would think you would be for affordable housing, right? But if you create such strict zoning laws, you make the housing stock shrink and you make prices go to the moon. I am shocked by the housing prices in California, and
Yeah.
it
They
seems
are
like
shocking.
the only way the only way out of it is deregulation, getting rid of all these zoning policies. Why don't we see the government doing something like that? Because this appears to be a largely manufactured problem with all these regulations at the local level.
Right, but then you also, so this is a massive debate, both at the state level and at the local level. And people who already own their homes don't want to get rid of that because this is an asset. This is, their family wealth is built around the single family home that they have. And so who wants to get rid of that and have, aspects of the neighborhood, the prices come down, and then the value of their single family home comes down. On the other side, of course, people need to be housed and they need to be able to afford to live there and to live within a decent proximity of their job. The Most people do not take public transportation. It doesn't go to the places that they need to go. And so one of the plans that is being pushed hard on the left side is to build these communities around public transportation. Again, those those buildings are majority luxury apartment buildings and luxury condos. So nobody who is going to be able to afford that is going to give up their BMW or their Mercedes to be able to take public transportation somewhere. They're going to drive their car. That's part of the culture here too. So, does there need to be deregulation on those issues? Yeah, I think that that is something that those who are supportive of affordable housing are looking to do. And I don't think the deregulation aspect of it is a right or left issue. I think it's how are we going to get more affordable housing, and the zoning restrictions are an obstacle to that, absolutely. And that is what's being debated again at the state level and at the local level. And I haven't seen much traction go in either direction. I think this is going to continue to be a debate because both sides are entrenched.
It seems like this problem is spreading across the country, though, this housing crisis. And it seems like it makes every other societal problem that we have worse. And now we see a lot of journalists or people who purport to be journalists talking about how a renter society is better, how, we shouldn't care. But it's quickly emerging that, rents go up pretty fast. And housing, as you mentioned, is a pretty safe bet in the long term to build intergenerational wealth. And it seems like
Yeah,
California is kind of the canary in the coal mine or the
yeah,
warning for the rest of the country that eventually, restricting the construction of housing leads to homelessness, poverty, extreme commuting, and ultimately just very suboptimal outcomes.
absolutely. And every level, as you say. So rents here, you can't get a one bedroom in a location that you would be able to walk to things or anything like that for less than $2,500 a month. It's at New York City, Manhattan levels, right? $3,000. So that is really high, and that's really high for even middle class. That's really high for anybody unless you're making well over $100,000 a year. So
So
yeah, it
you have a society of haves and
and have
have-nots,
nots.
and the middle class just seems to just head for the exit door in California. And you guys have a
Absolutely.
higher poverty rate than Mississippi at this point. So, when is the political class going to wake up and say, hey, like, we got to stop the exodus?
Honestly, I don't know when they're going to actually do something about that because it is going to take a concerted effort on both sides. And it's California is mostly run by Democrats at this point. The legislature is Democratic, the governor is Democratic, at least for the time being. And so I don't know honestly when they're going to actually do something about this. I don't think it's a matter of there's going to be a critical level of an exit by people. I don't think that's what's going to do it. I think it's going to have to be a lot of voices clamoring for something to be done who are still staying here in the state. I don't think people leaving is what is going to be the impetus for it. It's got to be a lot of groundswell and a lot of groundwork by people at the local level to demand a change in zoning and demand a change in terms of being able to house the homeless specifically, which is a crisis right now.
And that's something we see as journalists, right? We see the momentum growing behind the issue. And you already mentioned that you're seeing people of all
Yeah,
political persuasions and backgrounds largely agree that we have to change the way we're doing things, or else, things
right.
aren't going to get better.
I mean, this is the thing about being a journalist that I love is that you need to keep your ear to the ground. You need to hear um, what those whispers are that are happening, but they're adamant, right? They may be whispers, but they're strong and they're passionate, and so you need to be able to take that ball and run with it, and you need to be able to have a news manager, right, a senior or a news editor, whoever it is that you're working with, to be able to trust you and say, yeah, give you the space to be able to run with that because it is the job of journalists to really call these things out at the earliest possible moment so that something can actually be done at the political level. And it doesn't always happen, but it's sure meant to work that way.
Well, Dina, I really appreciate your time. As journalists, we don't have a lot of time. And I like the way you approach this. Journalism isn't always glamorous, but it is extremely rewarding, isn't it?
It is. It is. I love it, and there's nothing else I could imagine doing. It's how you get to know people, and you get to know humanity and yourself. So if somebody feels that calling, I hope they follow it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, David. Thanks for having me.
What a lively conversation with Miss Demetrios. A lot of times people don't realize how hard journalism is. We're expected to be experts at everything, and we lack one critical thing: time. We have to take a crash course in nearly everything, and we're always accused of being biased, and we lack time, resources, and bandwidth to be able to do a story justice. And it's a really hard job. On our off days, you notice in our voice and you see it on our face. And then we have to watch recordings of ourselves from our off days. So always remember, journalism, low margins, the fastest disappearing white-collar profession in the world. Also one of the hardest jobs, but also one of the most rewarding jobs. Talk about a profession where you get to meet people, learn more, and make sure that you have your ear to the ground and are listening to change. We get to learn about things, as my guest pointed out, far before the general public. We see the little upwellings of change, and that we're always way ahead of the curve. And that's why this is such a rewarding profession. In today's complicated media landscape, we have to make up new business models to meet the challenges that we have today, specifically monetization and making a profit off of delivering unbiased news. Let's face it, folks, it's nearly impossible. But in the meantime, we're trying to make the impossible possible every single day. On that note, I'm David Grasso for Follow the Prophet. We'll catch you next time. I'd like to thank my entire production team, including our executive producers, Debbie Myers, and former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, as well as our young interns who are making sure this show is fresh and relevant for all of you. Follow the Prophet is a production of Gingrich 360 and iHeartRadio. You can download us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.